Hello again, class. All right. Today we'll focus on our second lecture in a series on the political heritage, of the United States. And in our first lesson, remember we talked about ancient laws going back to Hammurabi's Code, the Jewish laws set out in the Old Testament, including the Ten Commandments. Then we jumped ahead to some major breakthroughs in English law, like Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights. In this lesson, which will probably be pretty short, we're just going to focus on colonial America. All right, so that time after England had founded the 13 colonies, but before our Declaration of Independence, because self-government in the colonies did not just happen the day on July 4th, 1776. The colonies had been governing themselves to some extent, just like regular English citizens did back in England, pretty much since the beginning, and was when this self-government was taken away in part through the whole taxation without representation and all those things. You should remember from your 8th grade history class. It's when the self-government was taken away that the colonies decided to rebel and to start their own country. So today let's focus on where that self-government and what it was during the colonial time period. And the first and earliest is the House of Burgesses. And remember, this was started, as we're going to see, in 1619, only 12 years after England founded its first colony at Jamestown, Virginia. And when these English citizens came to America as colonists, they brought these concepts of self-government and limited government with them. All right, the concepts we talked about last time set forth in the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights. And so in 1619, Virginia, again, this is about 12 years after Jamestown was founded, Virginia creates the first elected legislature in the colonies in America, and they call it the House of Burgesses. You see a picture of it there on the right. And so, as of 1619, all right, now again, we're talking, a good almost 160 years before they declare independence, 150 years plus. Before declaring independence, colonists, to some extent, are writing their own laws through a representative government. So remember, people in England, had some sort of representation going back to Magna Carta, but it comes forward in 1619 in the colonies. So Virginians would elect people from their town or from their area to go represent them in this legislative body called the House of Burgesses, who would then write laws for Virginia. Now again, they weren't totally free from the king or anything. The king could still outrank them, so to speak. The king was still in charge of the colonies. But for reasons we'll talk about at the end of this lesson, the king was basically letting them take care of local matters more or less themselves. All right, so the House of Burgesses is the first self-government that takes place in what would become the United States. Just a year later, we're going to get our second example, and that would be the Mayflower Compact. This is in 1620, so you should all be familiar with Pilgrims and the Mayflower and Plymouth Rock and that story you've been hearing about since elementary school. But understand, this wasn't just a neat story about the first Thanksgiving. This is important to the development of our country, because when the Pilgrims sailed to Plymouth, and while they were still on their ship, the Mayflower, they created the Mayflower Compact. Compact is just a fancy word for a contract or formal agreement. And they felt they needed to have some sort of laws when they got off. They understood they were about to set up this new colony there at Plymouth Rock. And they realized, they're not in England anymore. They don't have this system of government in place. So they better have something to sort of govern them and guide them. And so what they agreed to do, and essentially it's only about one paragraph. It's a very short document. It's a very famous document, but it's sort of surprising in how short it is and how vague and generic it really is. Because basically all they do in 17th century English is say that they're going to agree to work together to agree to laws for the good of the colony, and that once they agree upon these laws, they all promise to obey them. Okay, so this is the first written document creating rules for self-government in America. And think back to previous lessons we had when we talked about what a social contract is. This is very much a social contract, and essentially that's all it does. It say, look, since we're all going to have a hand in creating these laws, then we promise to obey them. And after all, that's what Rousseau and some of those thinkers were talking about when they talked about social contracts, that if you want people to obey the laws, then they have to have some agreement or some hand in creating those laws. And that's what the Pilgrims created with the Mayflower Compact. All right, so here, English founds its first colony in Americas in 1607, and by 1620, just 13 years later, we already have a representative body. We have a written social contract that sets out self-government. All right, so self-government springs up in America almost as soon as the first colonists arrive. And they continue having it. We're not going to go through all 13 colonies, but just talk about some of the more famous examples. You had the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, written in 1636. And what you see is a lot of times throughout American history, even up through today, it's a constant expansion of rights and people being allowed to participate in the political process. So like the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, it gave voting rights to non-church members. That really wasn't a thing, especially up in New England. You basically had to be a member of the Puritan church to be allowed to vote. But in Connecticut, they say no. Your political rights shouldn't be connected to what church you go to. And just like the English nobles had done back at the Magna Carta, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut limits the power of government. And so this is a type of constitution or charter. All right, so we're going to spend much of the semester talking about the U.S. Constitution, the one that's still in place now. But the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut was a type of constitution for the Connecticut colony. All right, so it's a document from which a government grants certain rights or privileges to the people and basically promises to protect those rights and privileges. Similarly, Pennsylvania drafted the Pennsylvania Charter of Privileges. All right, so this is in 1701. All right, so we're jumping ahead in the story about 65 years here. And Pennsylvania promises religious freedom and an elected assembly. All right, so you should see sort of building to what is going to be in the Constitution. We're going to see a lot of these same principles. All right, elected representatives, all right, religious freedom, voting rights. All of those are fundamental principles within our current Constitution. But you see, again, they didn't just spring forth from the minds of James Madison and Benjamin Franklin during the Constitutional Convention. These ideas have been around a long time. So our Constitution is sort of the end result of a lot of years of self-government expanding more and more until you ended up getting to the Constitution. So why did the king, because we know, if you remember from 8th grade history, the king's eventually going to shut down some of the colonies' rights to govern themselves. So why was the king doing so or not doing so earlier? Why were the colonies basically allowed to run themselves throughout most of the 1600s? And there's really three reasons for this. One is the distance. Remember, we're talking about 1600. All right, the king couldn't just Snapchat the colonies and tell them what to do. All right, not only certainly were there no social media, there wasn't even airplanes, email, fax machines, anything like that. All right, so people in England really didn't know what was going on in the colonies and vice versa on a very frequent basis. You'd have to write for someone to write a letter or send you a copy of a newspaper that may take a couple months to get to England. So there's not that much the king could control from an ocean away. Second, part of it was tradition. Remember, you had the Magna Carta. And then later in the 1600s, King William and Queen Mary, agreed to the English Bill of Rights. And so certainly the idea that English people were allowed to govern themselves to some extent existed prior to those colonists coming to America, and they brought those ideas with them, and they expected those traditions to continue here. And finally, British kings had their own problems. Our British had a civil war in the 17th century. They had the Glorious Revolution that we've talked about, when Queen Mary basically kicked her own father off the throne. And so if you were sitting in England, or if you were a king in England, and you're worried, your own daughter may at the very least try to take your throne, if not, hang you or chop off your head. What did you care if some tobacco farmers in Virginia were making a few laws about, local taxes or regulations about tobacco growing? You had bigger problems, if you were the British king in the 17th century than worrying about the colonists. And they pretty much let the colonists fend for themselves. And so this concept of ignoring them, which turned out to be for their own good, because they had this system of governing themselves. So when they kicked out Britain, they were basically ready to kind of put a new government in place. This concept is known as salutary neglect. And it is very beneficial for the Americans, because if you've seen throughout world history, you see a lot of examples of one group of people, rebelling against their government or against their colonist rulers and kicking them out, but not being nearly ready to start governing themselves, once they get rid of the old government, and can tend to lead to some pretty chaotic and anarchy. But we didn't have that here in America, and one reason is because there was such a long history of people governing themselves. People like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, they had served in the House of Burgesses back before, declaring independence for America. And so a lot of the leaders in America, because of this history of self-government, were ready to start governing themselves as soon as, they defeated the Redcoats. All right, so I told you this would be a pretty short lesson. We'll stop right here. The next lesson, we're going to talk about the Enlightenment. This was sort of a philosophical and scientific movement that was taking place both in Europe and America during the 16 and 1700s. And we'll talk about how the Enlightenment led to new ideas on politics and government in our next lesson.